Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. There's a topic that I wanted to cover today, and I suspect many of you will find it interesting because we have to get some of our terms under control going forward toward the midterm elections in November. And it's high time to do that. And the reason that my hair's a little bit on fire because of it is that on Tuesday, when three progressive candidates won their primaries in New York, there was sort of this outcry in the media about how there was a civil war in the Democratic Party. And all of a sudden, Trump and a number of his loyalists are talking about how the communists are taking over America and so on. And all of this sort of hyperbolic, honestly craziness. We need to get a rein on that and make sure that people understand the terms that we are talking about. So let me give you a really quick rundown and on these terms. And just to be clear, if we were in a graduate seminar, I would not be doing this in 3 sentences. We would be really digging into these, but I don't think anybody wants that right now. If you ever want me to do it, I'm happy to. But the first thing you need to know is that I'm going to talk about communism, socialism, liberal democracy, and um, fascism as economic systems. And then I'll talk a little bit about the political part of them as well. Okay. So one of the things let's do is start with the middle. The United States of America is a liberal democracy. And in our liberal democracy, we tend to support the system of economics called capitalism. And I'm a little bit hedging there because I have real issues with the way we talk about capitalism and what it means. But just so we're in the same ballpark, that means that we tend to honor the idea of private enterprise and private property. And there are limits to that, but that's the way to think about the economic system under which the people in the United States of America live. And again, this is killing me because there's a lot of exceptions to that and a lot of things that I think we should pay attention to. But now I'm going to shut up because that's a rabbit hole that's totally going to confuse people. Anyway, stand on that the United States of America is now and has always been, for the most part, I can't avoid some of my caveats there, a country based in the kind of economic system that we know of as capitalism. Communism calls for the destruction of that kind of an economy. It wants there to be communal ownership of the means of production. So that means not only things like hospitals and schools and roads, but also the factory that produces crackers and screwdrivers and decides where different kinds of public benefits will be allocated for the growing of soybeans, for example. In its ideological form, that's what communism looks like. And then on the other side of that, we have fascism, and fascism is on the far right. And the fascism concept of the economy of fascism is that the government and the businessmen work together to drive the economy. All right, so now if you think about that not as an economic system but as a political system, you have very different kinds of political systems in each of those things. So in a liberal democracy, the idea is that the people get to elect their representatives, and those representatives makes laws for everybody in the community or in the country, and the laws apply to everybody, and we live under the rule of law, and you can always change your leaders if you don't like them, and so on. That is not the case in the political systems under communism or under fascism, where both of them tend to go toward authoritarianism. And especially on the right, the the relationship between the political system and the economic system go very much hand in hand, because in many ways the use of the government to protect those business people who want private property becomes part of the whole mission of fascism. So people on truly the left, that is, those people who embrace communism, or on the right, those people who embrace fascism, do not want the existence of liberal democracy. They don't trust it for one reason or another. Communists usually because they think it is too embedded in racism and sexism and classism to be fair to the people. People on the right because they think that the average person is not really capable of directing his or her interests, and that has to be taken over by a very small group of people. Usually about 10% on both sides is the argument. All right. That's not what's happening in the United States at all. And if I see somebody talking about democratic socialists in the United States as the left, my hair is going to catch on fire, because you notice I didn't talk about socialism in those three divisions. Socialism is adjacent to communism, and it too calls for the people to own the means of production. And the distinction between socialism and communism doesn't really matter in this context, although they are different things. But in both of them, they don't want private property. They want the government to own stuff for the good of the people. All right. So let's now, if you've got those three concepts set, let's jump to what's happening right now in the United States of America. In the United States of America, we have a system in which our country, our political system, and our freedoms are under attack, not from the left. The communists are not causing a problem in the United States right now. And just FYI, they never have. They have never had the numbers in the United States as those people on the far right, who always complain that anything that the American people want is communism or socialism, and therefore it's taking us to down the road to authoritarianism. And that has always just been, sort of a boogeyman rhetoric. And I've talked a million times about where we got that, but I'm not going to go into that today. All right. So in the United States, our liberal democracy, and liberal democracy is a democratic system that protects individuals and their ability to become the people that they want to be. And in the United States of America, until about 1900, not really, but until about 1900, the idea was you wanted to keep government small, because if it got big, it would infringe on freedom. And once you got the rise of major corporations and industries in the United States in about 1870, late 1860s, early 1870s, people started to recognize that if you had a corporation like U.S. Steel, and you had somebody like Andrew Carnegie who was able to treat his workers terribly and so on, you needed to have a big government to protect individuals against the concentration of wealth. So beginning in around the turn of the century, and really in the early 20th century, you get a period called the Progressive Era, in which the government, under people like Theodore Roosevelt, actively works to rein in the major corporations and the really wealthy guys so that they just don't get everything. And so in our liberal democracy, the idea of liberalism continues to protect the individual, but it argues you need to have regulations, and you need to have a basic social safety net. And the government does have to get involved in stuff like transportation or healthcare or education and so on in order to protect that individual. That is now under attack in the United States by those on the right, by those people who are openly embracing the idea of pulling together government and business so they can concentrate wealth and exercise power over the rest of us. And quite literally, if you're watching Donald Trump, he is using the US government to take pieces of US corporations and say, well, the government's going to own a stake in this, and now you have to do what we say. It's not gotten nearly as much press as it ought to have, but that's what's happening there. All right. So in the United States right now, we have the Republican Party, which I'm going to tell you a lot more about in just a minute, has become, it cracked in the 1990s, and it has now become a far right I'm going to call it a fascist party because it's under the control of Donald Trump, who is openly doing fascist things. So it has moved into that far right that says we're going to get rid of liberal democracy. We're going to stop people from voting. We're going to tell them, we're going to get women back into the home. We're going to do all the hallmarks of fascism. And that's who the Republicans are now. But now, if you think about the rest of the people in the United States, you got to remember that most people in the United States right now identify as independents, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as independents. And you have the Democratic Party, which has been trying to hold the line against fascism now for a long time. And I'm not going to go into why I think that's been a hard thing for them to do. I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again. But the Democratic Party has systems in all the states, and that matters. It matters to have infrastructure. And they have in the past tried to gain power against the far right by trying to appeal to what they considered the middle right. Like they sort of believed their base would come to them, but they needed to get that middle right. And so they haven't really made very vocal stances against a lot of the positions that the far right took. And in their defense, by the way, that's what it took to get elected, because there weren't people fired up saying, hey, we really want X or we really want Y. And so they tried to cobble together what they could to do things like protect Social Security, which the far right was trying to cut, or to advance universal health care, which happened under Obama, and so on. But now, all of a sudden, one of the reasons that the Democrats had trouble getting more traction than they should have, in my opinion, is because that far right talked a good game, and they got their base all riled up, but they kept a lot of the guardrails of liberal democracy in place. Like the number of times that Republicans would threaten to cut Social Security, and then, people like me would say they're going to cut your Social Security, and people would say you're lying, you're just on the left, you're not. This isn't really going to happen. You're trying to scare us. That happened again and again over one thing after another. And the Republicans, not the far right Republicans, but the ones who were sort of not quite MAGA yet, knew that if they did things like took away reproductive rights and cut Social Security and cut SNAP and did all those things, that they would lose voters. So they talked a lot, but they did it in a really unquiet way. And you really saw this with John Roberts in the Supreme Court, for example, whose specialty was not overturning court decisions, it was hollowing them out, which he did with the Voting Rights Act, so that people could say, what are you talking about? They haven't touched Roe v. Wade. Well, they would hollow it out is what they would do. And there were still the trappings there so that a lot of people didn't see what was happening. Trump comes in his second term with a wrecking ball and has proceeded to dismantle a lot of the pieces of liberal democracy that people believed would continue to exist. And as a result of that, a lot of people who were like, hey, this stuff is fine, like I'm not really great, but I sure don't like those Democrats, are suddenly now saying, wait a minute, what happened here? At the same time that the Trump administration is pouring resources in behind an incredibly corrupt system that has made Elon Musk a trillionaire, although he's now below that thing again because of the losses he's taken this week in his businesses. But, basically we're running the government to concentrate wealth among the Trump family, their cronies, and among billionaires. And he's spending tax dollars like absolute water. I mean, it's killing the old Yankee in me here, and taking them away from things like children who need supplemental nutrition assistance programs, which, by the way, in the United States of America, we should not have hungry people. And we certainly shouldn't have hungry children, but we shouldn't have hungry people, right? We're an incredibly wealthy country, but again, we have concentrated wealth among this really, really small group of people. So we've watched them cutting things like SNAP, and now we have overheard Mike Johnson, the Republican of Louisiana, who's the Speaker of the House, talking about how after the midterms they're expecting to cut Social Security, and we're watching how they have cut Medicaid, and in turn that has cut medical care, especially in rural areas. I think it's more than 400 medical facilities have closed, and we're watching them turn the people's government for their own ends. And I think what we are seeing as a result is more and more people stepping up and saying, hey, wait a minute, the government should serve us. Sometimes they work within the Democratic Party. Sometimes they are working within the Democratic Party and they are being called progressives or democratic socialists. I'm going to get there in a second. Sometimes they're running as independents. But what the message is across the board is that this country belongs to us. But those who are in power look at that and they look at somebody like Zoran Mamdani in New York City, or I'm going to talk to you about some other people too, and they say, oh, they're communists. They're not communists. And they say they are not communists. They do not want the people to own the means of production. What they are saying is something that is deeply embedded in US history all the way back to the very beginning. And what people like Zoran Mamdani, who calls himself a democratic socialist, is saying, and what some of the other groups I'm going to talk about in a minute are saying, is that in order to have a liberal democracy, the government must make sure the playing field is level enough that the rich people don't walk off with everything. And by the way, this is literally an issue in the United States of America before it's the United States of America. One of our most lasting laws that you probably remember from junior high, called the Northwest Ordinance, passed under the Articles of Confederation, says, hey, listen, we got to change the foundational laws of this country to get rid of something called primogeniture, which is the idea that when somebody dies, the oldest son gets everything. That was something in the U.S. Virginia inherited from Britain and got rid of it with the Northwest Ordinance in the Northwest Territories. And they also said we got to get rid of human enslavement because it does the same thing. It concentrates wealth among a really small group of people. And that's the heart of the Northwest Ordinance, which becomes the centerpiece of the Midwest, which matters in just a second. What they are saying is that they like a system that looked much more like America in the 1960s and the 1970s. And in that period, of course, people had enterprise and profits and private ownership of corporations and so on. But the government regulated those businesses to protect workers and to protect consumers. And the government owned the pieces of a society that people need to survive. Like they didn't own the government for cracker, or the government didn't own the company that produced crackers, because you don't have to have crackers to survive. But it did own telecommunications companies, or had a significant hand in telecommunications companies, transportation, and we still have the interstate highways, and hospitals, so that you didn't have to worry about private profit rather than healthcare, because you can't live without those things. Those things need to be regulated, and they need to be regulated to the point that they are not profit-making entities. That what they do is they bring the things that people need in order to survive. This is part of the survival of liberal democracy. And so these are not radical ideas. Somebody actually, I was doing an interview the other day and they said, what about these progressives out there? And it was an older person like me. And I said, please explain to me how any of the things that somebody like Zoran Mamdani is talking about, and I'm picking on him here because he can't run for president, which I think is important, because he's not a natural born US citizen, that he's able to try out stuff without people going, oh, he's running for president, right? Tell me how anything he has done is different in moving toward socialism than what we lived with in the 1970s, with the kinds of concepts we lived in the 1970s. And the reason I said that is because the idea that using the government to help people is fundamental to a liberal democracy. And the idea that saying we should come up with a system of healthcare in which everybody has healthcare is somehow outlandish simply does not reflect political theory, but it also doesn't reflect political reality. So Generally, the democratic socialists that are out there are not socialists who are in the Socialist Party arguing for the public ownership of the means of production. They're democratic socialists who are saying, why are we making healthcare a private profit industry? Because we need that. It's not like you're going to have a heart attack and like compare different hospitals. You're going to go to the closest one. Or, that's the sort of thing, or transportation, or public utilities. Same thing, that those are things that can be owned in common by our government to to make it possible for individuals to be able to plan the best life that they can plan, that they're not going without. And we have countries that do this already. And a great example of that is a country like Denmark. And Denmark has high taxes for sure. It also has state sponsored education, and it has healthcare, and it has a social safety net, and it has crackerjack innovation as well. It has private companies, it has all of those things. It simply has those basics of human life covered. All right, so I've given you this background on where these people stand now. And the reason I'm doing this is because it bothers me a lot that that radical right idea that somehow the government doing things like providing universal health care is communist, or it's going to destroy America, when in fact it is the central theme of US history. The radical right saying we should never do this, they are the ones who are outside American history, who are outside traditional America. And now I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that. If you take a look at, I pulled some of the numbers before I came on here today. If you take a look at the things that the Democrats and the Democratic Socialists are calling for right now, and that people say is progressive, or somehow they are not centrist, that we got to become centrist. And by centrist, what people seem to mean nowadays is that everybody needs to move over toward that far right. And they have done that deliberately. That was part of a political process called moving the Overton window, to make us think that it's normal for there to be masked thugs in the streets throwing people into unmarked vans. That's not normal. That's radical, and that's far right. Normal, centrist, if you will, is right here. Listen to this. Here are some of the numbers, the new numbers. 92% of Americans are worried about corruption in government. That's one of the positions that the Democratic Socialists are taking. Does that sound like that's a wacko idea? If 92% of Americans are worried about it? Between 60 and 80% of Americans, depending on how the question is asked, want higher taxes on the rich. Between 60 and 80%. That sounds to me like a centrist position, right? Here we go. When asked if the government has a responsibility to make sure all Americans have health care, 66% of Americans say yes, the government has a responsibility to do that. Only 33% say no. So is universal health care a fringe idea? Absolutely not. It is a centrist, if you will. It is the common, it is the majority opinion. I pulled a couple more. Where are they? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing I pulled one more that was like that. But the point here is that don't be misled by this rhetoric that's like things like universal healthcare. Now, we disagree about how to get that, and I'm not begin to opine about how we should get universal healthcare, because I don't know anything about healthcare except that I think we should all have it. That's why we have experts, and that's why we elect people to Congress to hash these things out. But the point is that we want those things. Saying you want those things is not some radical fringe idea. All right, so where are we going here? Where are we, when I talk about this not being a radical fringe idea, I wanted to quote something for you. And I'm not going to tell you what it's from, but until the end. But I want to read to you a political platform. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. But in all that government can individually, I'm sorry, but in all that people can do individually, but in all that people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. All right, so government should do the things for people that they need to do collectively. I'll tell you where that came from in a minute. Here's part of the platform. We shall ever build anew that our children and their children, without distinction because of race, creed, or color, may know the blessings of our free land. We're opposed to corruption, where we insist on honesty as an indispensable requirement of public service. We want to root out corruption whenever and wherever it appears. We are proud of and shall continue our far reaching and sound advances in matters of basic human needs. We call for expansion of Social Security, broadened coverage of unemployment insurance, improved housing, and better health care for all of our people. We are determined that our government remain warmly responsive to the urgent social and economic problems of our people. This calls for working around the world, not just for peace and freedom, but to assist friendly countries in their attempts to strengthen their economies. The U.S. should participate in an international fund for economic development for the rest of the world. We vigorously support the United Nations. We will maintain our military strength only as a guardian of the peace, as a deterrent to aggression. Key to our country are workers. Labor is the United States, the men and women who, with their minds, their hearts, and hands, create the wealth that is shared in this country. They are America. And because of that, we have raised the federal minimum wage for more than 2 million workers, extended Social Security for an additional 10 million workers, and the benefits were raised for 6.5 million. We have expanded unemployment insurance, and we have expanded workmen's compensation benefits, and expanded retirement benefits, and increased wages and welfare and pension plans for federal employees. We are also strongly behind the idea of unions. Unions are growing in strength and responsibility and are increasing their membership, and we support unions. We support free collective bargaining as well. And we are interested in improved job safety, improved education, improved assistance to the millions of workers with special problems, special employment problems, older workers, handicapped workers, members of minority groups, and migratory workers. We insist on equal pay for equal work, regardless of sex. How am I doing here? We want a higher minimum wage. We want to eliminate discrimination in employment because of race, creed, color, national origin, ancestry, or sex. We want to improve the economic conditions of areas faced with persistent and substantial unemployment. We want to protect the rights of labor unions and the rights of workers to organize. We believe that the physical, mental, and spiritual well-being of the people is as important as their economic health, and we will continue to support our conviction with vigorous action. We created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and we would like to brought that to the cabinet. And we are also interested in more investment in education. All right, so I put all that out there, and if you listen to that, a lot of what you're hearing in that is now being considered somehow, well, President Trump would call it communist, right? The reason I read it to you in such detail, that's the Republican Party platform in 1956. That's where the Republicans were in 1956. So the point I'm trying to make is that I have on occasion angered democratic socialists when I say, basically they're centrists. And I'm not suggesting their aims are farther right than they would like, but rather that the entire country is a democratic socialist country and has been since at least the 1860s. Because the reason people think we're not is because the radical right has made it look, has rhetorically taken all of these things that the Republican Party stood behind and said those things are communist. And in fact, what I just read to you, stronger unions, equal pay for equal work, protection for racial, religious, gender, sex, ability, minorities, all of those things was central to the Republican Party 50 years ago. More than that, because it's before I was born and I'm 63. So 70 years ago, right? And the the quotation that they started with, that I started when I said that was from Lincoln. And this was Lincoln came up with that statement that it's the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. That was the foundation of the Republican Party. And he is saying that because in a time that looks very much like our own, the at that time the Democrats had the elite Southern enslavers had taken over the Democratic Party, and they were using the government to concentrate wealth among a really small group of very wealthy Southern enslavers. And they were taking the resources of the American people and saying, we basically get everything. And Lincoln had to think of a reason, or not an ideology that says no. And so he went back to what government is supposed to do. And he said, no, actually, government should be a liberal democracy. It should protect individuals' ability to become whatever they want by not only giving them equal treatment before the law and the right to have a say in their government, but also equal access to resources. Whether in his case it was the mines in the West or the lands in the plains that the US was taking from indigenous people at the time, or education. That's a big deal. We get our public education, higher education institutions under the Republicans in 1862 with the Morrill College Act. It's also known as the Land Grant College Act. But nowadays, of course, that's expanded to include healthcare and so on. It was actually Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the last century who added healthcare to that idea. So that idea that the government should protect equality of before the law, but also equality of resources by leveling the economic playing field, and that was part of everybody having a vote, was deliberately an answer to the elite Southern enslavers who were like, no, 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 the Constitution protects property. We get it all. And the reason that Lincoln said that the way he did is because the radical enslavers, the elite Southern Democrats in the 1850s, said to the rising Republicans, you people are radicals. And you'll notice you never hear me talking about radical Republicans, because that was a construction that the elites, the elite Southern enslavers, put on people like Abraham Lincoln. And he gets up, there's a history behind what he says, but he gets up at Cooper Union in New York City and he answers them directly. And he says, you say we're radicals, but we're the conservatives. We're the ones who are protecting the Declaration of Independence. We're the ones who say you should be equal before the law, you should have a say in your government, and you should have equal access to resources. You're the ones who are saying the world should be based in the idea that humans are unequal and that they don't have to be treated equally before the law, and they don't have a right to a say in their government, and they don't have a right to equal access to resources. You're saying you get everything. You're the radicals. Those of us who care about the principles in the Declaration of Independence, we are the true conservatives. And the way that you get there is by guaranteeing the government produces a system that does those three things: equal protection of the laws, right to a say in your government, and equal access to resources. So now, when you have somebody like Donald Trump calling the progressives in New York communists, he's really just repeating exactly. They weren't using the word communist in that way at the time. They would be very quickly, but they weren't. So that's not something the elite enslavers said, but they would have. They called them instead radicals and anarchists and all sorts of things. But that's not communism. That's not anarchy. That's none of those things. It is dead center in the tradition of American politics, that this is what the government is supposed to do. And so, another piece of that in this moment is that in the period when Lincoln is rising and beginning to articulate this, and the American people as a whole are going like, wait a minute here, how do the rich guys get everything? We don't like this. You get, after 1854, when it really becomes clear that this is what's happening, you get a whole multiplicity of new people running for office. You get new political parties. You get the death of the Whig Party, and in the years from about 1855 to about 1856, 7, you get a whole bunch of new political parties. And what people really, all they know is that they don't like the slave power. They don't like that elite that's taking over everything. They don't yet know where their lines are. But as that happens, as you get all these new voices, you start to get coalescing around different ideas. And that's when you get Lincoln beginning to articulate a new vision for the country. And he doesn't do that until 1859. Crucially, he does so in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the piece that I have not put in here, and I kept focusing on New York somewhat deliberately, is that if you watch the Midwest right now, you've literally got people calling themselves prairie populists. And what do they want to do? They want to stop the consolidation where agribusiness is getting huge and getting rid of family farms and basically turning them all into serfs. You want to get they want to stop corruption. They want the economy to be fair again. They want to have health care and they want to have education. The same thing that they're talking about in New York City. And the same thing, by the way, that entrepreneurs have talked about all along, because it's not just the workers and the farmers who are hurt if wealth concentrates. It's anybody who's got a new idea and says, hey, I've got an idea for an app. Well, you can't use it until you can't, you got to sell it to one of the big guys. And that's actually something the Biden administration was all over when Lena Khan was in office. And of course, Trump has turned that around so that you literally have people like John Deere saying that people don't have the right to repair their vehicles. And this is actually a big deal in Maine too, not for John Deere, but for boats. You have to be able to repair your own engines, and that's an issue. So I think what you're seeing when you see the rise of populist candidates or prairie populist candidates or progressives in New York or whatever people are calling themselves is this general protest of a rigged system in which a few people get everything. And believe me, it's a fight, and it's going to be a fight, and it's going to settle out in ways that we can't foresee right now. And some of the people getting tossed up in these primaries and these elections, some of them we're going to forget about. They're going to end up to be flashes in the pan. Someday I'll tell you where that line comes from. Or they're going to turn out to be idiots, or they're going to be corrupt or whatever. But some of them are going to be William Henry Seward, and some of them are going to be James G. Blaine, and some of them, at least one of them, is going to be Abraham Lincoln. So when you see this and there's all this, oh my God, there's a fight in the Democratic Party, it's like, no, this is just a normal part of this dramatic political change we're going through. And rather than being afraid of it, let's embrace it and see what new ideas people have, and recognize that what the people who are being thrown up right now are calling for is a return to a system in which the American government works for the American people rather than working for a very small group of people, of elites. And if you are in part of that movement, don't let anybody tell you you're fringe. I mean, you're standing right there with Dwight Eisenhower and with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and with Theodore Roosevelt and with James Garfield, and I'm sorry, I got to throw this in here, with Grover Cleveland. He's one of my favorites, and with U.S. Grant and with Abraham Lincoln. This is what they argued, and it is not at all a radical position. The idea that a few rich people should get everything, that's the radical position. So I just had to say that because I picked up the papers today and saw a comment about how, there's a civil war in the Democratic Party, and, what's going to happen between, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is more and more new voices are going to come into the party, and voters are going to decide which is the direction they want to go. And if I had to take money, it's going to look a lot more like FDR and Eisenhower and Theodore Roosevelt and Lincoln than it is going to look like James Henry Hammond, the Southern senator before the Civil War, who said basically, we should run everything. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea von Kampen.